So for people who were interested in defending the traditions of the West, democracy, equality, all the good stuff, communism did not look like such a bad alternative. Since 1917, a communist party had been in charge in Russia. Russia at the time was called the Soviet Union, or full title was the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. Now, Soviet is a Russian word that means council. And Soviet Republic means that you have councils of workers and peasants originally. This speaks to the very beginnings of the revolution in Russia in 1917, where in fact you had direct democracy. And considering the history of the labor movement, that is not so unusual. The first groups that practiced democracy, where everybody is invited to share their views and to vote, were groups in the labor movement in the United States in the 1820s, during the French revolutions in the 1780s and 90s, and throughout the 19th century. So if you really were looking for a place where democracy is practiced, the labor movement, and then later on socialist and communist, as well as anarchist parties that were part of this labor movement, that would have been the place to go. In the so-called bourgeois parties, that is to say, liberal and conservative parties, it was a whole lot more top-down. You had party leaders in charge, and while membership was invited to join and participate, they did not enjoy as much of a voice and input. On the other side, however, in the tradition of the labor movement, you have Marx's notion that after a revolution, you have to put down those who want to rebuild the old order, capitalism, the nation state, and so forth. And because they still have lots of power and followers in society, there is a need for a dictatorship of the proletariat, in other words, of the working class, of the communists. In order to have democracy in the long run, you have to first defeat the enemies. Another component of communism as practiced in Russia was, of course, that the means of production had been nationalized. In other words, all heavy industry, transportation networks, distribution networks were run not directly by the government, but were owned by the people and were operated by appointees of the government. The way this is organized varies greatly, and they experiment with all kinds of different forms. But the bottom line is, there is no more group in society that is the owners of large-scale business. To what extent this also includes small-scale operations is different at different times and in different countries. In East Germany, for instance, when that was a communist country between 1949 and 1989, it was usually a matter that small shops, even little craft workshops and so forth, were left in the hands of their owners. Farms, large-scale factories, etc., were ordinarily nationalized. But this was a recipe for success. In the Great Depression, the Soviet Union did not have a dent in their economic activity. You did not have people standing in bread lines or at soup kitchens. There was no unemployment, and growth rates of economic development in the double digits, 10, 20%, throughout the 1930s when Western countries were struggling. So you can see how this is appealing, especially against the fall of the rise of fascism in the West. No other country had a larger communist party than Germany. At the time that in Russia, membership in the party was already inflated because some people signed up opportunistically. In Germany, you still risked something if you joined the party, and it had millions of members, more than any other country. There were two uprisings in Germany that attempted to establish a communist government both failed and were put down in part by militias that later on joined the Nazi Party. And in 1932, as I already mentioned, the Communist Party had received 15% of the votes. And of course, it was outlawed 2 months later, and most of its members sent to concentration camps. Now, the German example also shows the difference between communism and social democracy, or socialism more broadly. The Social Democratic Party of Germany had been around since the 1860s. And for the duration of the Weimar Republic between 1918 and 1933, it was mostly the governing party. The revolution in 1918 that had gotten rid of the German emperor had left the Social Democrats as the main political power. And they used that to leave capitalism in place, to support in order to, for the first time in German history, actually, to establish a constitution that checked off all the basic marks that you have in the United States, that Bill of Rights, civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, as well as a parliamentary democracy, and a government answerable directly to parliament, rather than in the US, a presidential system where you have the head of state running the government. In the German case, there was a nominal head of state, a president elected by the people, but who had little to say about how the government was run, except he appointed it. Anyway, so the Social Democrats had no thought of making Germany into a communist country. They did not want to abolish capitalism. They just wanted the capitalists to recognize unions and to pay people decent wages. And they had no interest in abolishing democracy. In fact, the Social Democrats took it as a dual struggle. On the one hand, to defend capitalism against the communists, on the other hand, to defend democracy against the fascists and the far right. Now, capitalism did not necessarily want its social democratic defenders. In fact, to the extent that the leaders of business became politically active, they committed wholeheartedly to financing fascism. Henry Ford in the United States is one example that you've already heard about. You might have heard about Krupp and Thyssen, two actual men who owned big steel companies and who were leaders of the German heavy industry, who gave generously to Hitler, and starting in 1930 really built up the Nazi Party as an antidote to democracy, because under a democratic system you could have labor unions, you could have communists, and so forth. And in Italy, the Agnelli family that ran the Fiat works, which stands for Fattoria Italiano Automobile di Torino, and is currently pretty popular here, was largely responsible for financing Mussolini. And what they got for their money was good. They no longer had to deal with labor unions. Communist and socialist parties were outlawed, and business was never better than when Mussolini placed large-scale orders for military equipment and so forth with Italian industry. To an extent, if you remember what Louis Adamick was saying in the article about Bill Bridges, the labor leader on the waterfront in San Francisco, Adamick was saying the owners of businesses are inherently dictatorially minded. They're autocrats. They don't want democracy. They don't think that the common people, the guys who work for them, have anything to say and should have anything to say. So they run their businesses that way. They don't want to share power with the unions, and really they also want to run government that way. So the idea of having a businessman run the government like a business is basically the entryway to saying, yes, you do want a dictatorship, because how do you run a business? Certainly not by democratic elections. There's a longer running fear of leveling, of equality the notion that if you have democracy and if people are equal under the law, and if people have equal rights politically, what's gonna stop them to come after my money and redistribute the wealth so that everybody has equal economic opportunity as well? And since the legitimacy of capitalism was shaky following the crash of 1929, the wealthy did have some cause to believe that their rights and privileges might be threatened. And they responded to that with a strong defense of inequality, with the praise of inequality. And nothing really says defense and praise of inequality than the ideology of fascism that elevates the people, the Germans, the Italians, what have you, the real Germans, above everybody else, and says that really everything is a struggle, only the strong win, we are the strongest, that gives us the right to do whatever we want. That matches quite nicely. You've seen this with Carnegie, you've seen it with Ford, with the self-image that businessmen, business leaders often end up having. So who is there that is still in favor of democracy? Really only the left. In practice, in Germany, in France, in Italy, the only people who stand up to fight, to defend democracy against fascism are socialists and even communists in the case of Spain. In spite of the fact that they're really not in favor of democracy, they are nevertheless less in favor of fascism, obviously. And it is this alliance of democracy and socialism that also informs FDR's New Deal. But like social democrats elsewhere, FDR is not willing to give up on democracy. In fact, you could say that the New Deal was an exercise in, is not willing to give up on capitalism. The New Deal is an exercise in stabilizing and defending capitalism by saving it from itself, by making it less inhumane and more compatible with democracy. But this is a very narrow path. And by 1941, when he gives the Four Freedoms speech, who's left? England, the United States, maybe Sweden, as countries that haven't been overrun by the Nazis, that haven't switched to fascism. Certainly also a few Latin American democracies, but dictatorship is on the rise there as well. Mexico comes to mind as a good example. But Roosevelt wants to show that democracy and capitalism can go hand in hand. Normally at this point in history, it is either one or the other. And if you are defending democracy, chances are you're a critic of capitalism. And if you're in favor of democracy, chances are of capitalism. If you are a friend of capitalism, chances are you are also a fascist. Now, where does that leave the communists? Because Roosevelt's option is the social democratic path. A critique of capitalism, a notion that you have to civilize it, but nonetheless a commitment to private ownership of property in the means of production. Where do the communists position themselves in relation to democracy? This changes over time. For a brief overview, between 1928 and 1933, largely driven by the German experience, the German Communist Party considered the Social Democrats to be worse than the Nazis. And there is some legitimacy to that claim. But what that meant is that they failed to make common cause with the Social Democrats when the Nazis took over. Learning from that experience, between 1933 and 1936, communists the world over followed a united front policy, meaning that communists and socialists will make common cause, but they wouldn't go so far as to also include liberals or people like the Catholic Center Party in Germany, who wanted to defend democracy without wanting to criticize capitalism. So the United Front that encompasses all of the labor movement and its political parties. After 1936, following a successful experiment in France, where socialists and communists, together with liberals and other Democrats, formed a government, the World Communist Movement embraced the notion of a popular front. All people, all segments of the population that are opposed to fascism and that want to defend democracy work together, and that includes the communists. In 1939, when the Popular Front government in France was falling apart, and Stalin, as the leader of the Soviet Union, made common cause with Hitler in partitioning Poland, communist parties everywhere abandoned the Popular Front approach and went into a fundamental opposition, refusing to work with democratic parties or even other parts of the labor movement. In spite of that, however, those communists in the United States who had joined the unions, for instance, continued to do that. So it didn't actually mean they gave up on unionizing. But this was a shock that delegitimized communism in the eyes of many. That after 1939, they essentially assumed that the Nazis were on their side because it just so happened that Hitler and Stalin had made a pact of non-aggression. When Hitler broke that pact in 1945 and invaded the Soviet Union, the communist parties the world over switched again to a broad defense of the Soviet Union, saying, we'll support anybody who is willing to fight against the Nazis, no matter how democratically minded they otherwise are. So communists in the West played a dubious role in this whole process. But if you reread with this background, or if you start reading the For Freedom speech, you see how this all comes together in Roosevelt's speech. Civil liberties, meaning the liberal tradition of constitutional government out of the 18th century. Social justice, to take on board the criticism of capitalism that comes from the labor movement and from socialism. And democracy, a commitment to broadest popular participation in politics against dictatorship, comes together and marks Roosevelt as a kind of American version of social democracy. And what would have been the alternative? The alternative would have been for the West to ally with Hitler against the Soviet Union. If it was just about capitalism versus socialism, then that would have been the logical conclusion, because Germany was clearly still a capitalist country. The power of the barons of industry was unbroken and in fact was growing under Hitler. They had a seat at the table. They were making good money. The Soviet Union was a communist country, no capitalism there. And many conservatives in the West were arguing that in fact the common enemy is communism. Hitler is a good capitalist, he's a good anti-communist, so we need to make common cause with him. Among the people in the US who said that was, of course, Henry Ford and his America First committee, where he collaborated with such great men as Walt Disney and Charles Lindbergh. And it is these who Roosevelt means when he says those who want to stay out of the war, who are really giving aid and comfort to our enemy by trying to keep us out of the war, will be met with the greatest possible force. We will make sure that they fall in line, and that when this country goes to war to defend democracy, they will also have to do their part, like it or not. This is one of the things that the fascists in this country never forgave Roosevelt for. So neutrality to give art would have meant to take a side. Neutrality would have meant that you are in effect aiding Hitler, that you're giving him breathing room. What you needed to do was in fact to actively fight the fascists. if you saw any value at all in constitutional order, in equality, in democracy, and so forth, not merely in capital. One example, and this is where we return to the cheese-eating surrender monkeys, to quote The Simpsons. One place where this didn't happen was France in 1940. The French elites, and if you remember, if you read my lecture slides on anti-Semitism, you remember that France was a hugely anti-Semitic country, especially the Catholic right, including most of the officer corps of the armed forces. So the French, among the French upper class, among the elites in France, most people sympathized with Hitler, and they hated their own government, which was run by a socialist of Jewish faith, Leon Blum. They considered this to be an abomination. And when Hitler came in, they didn't really want to fight. They thought that Hitler would take care of their own problem, of the communists, of the Jews, and of the communist Jews. So when the French army folded in 1940, when the Germans invaded, it really wasn't because they were militarily beaten. It was because the officers decided that it was time to quit and to let the Nazis take over. Many of them joined the SS to fight against the Soviet Union in 1940, where the French remained in possession of their overseas territories. For instance, the big chunk of the French fleet was anchored in the bay, in the part on the French island of Martinique in the Caribbean. The population of Martinique was predominantly black because they are descendants of slaves working on the sugar plantations. Now you have this, the Navy, the French Navy stationed there, including an aircraft carrier and high-tech battleships and so forth. The British and the Americans can't get there. They're too well sheltered in that bay, but they can't sail away either because then the Americans and the British would get them. So here you have a fleet that works for the Nazi ally, the French wartime government that sides with Hitler, that is sitting right there in the Caribbean and poses a threat. There, the admiral in charge of that fleet runs the government in Martinique and institutes a racial terror regime similar to what you have in Germany. So on this island that is majority African by background, you have French Nazis running the show, right, basically in the backyard of the United States. So that is how in France the elites, the right wing, decided that Hitler was the lesser evil, and that they really liked the idea of getting rid of the left and getting rid of all these people who they didn't like to begin with, like the Jews and so forth. So this is an example of how not to do it. And of course, for Roosevelt, this was already happening. He saw how it had gone with France, and therefore the need to mobilize the people in the United States to say, if we fight for democracy and if we fight for capitalism, it's going to be worth it for you. Your life is going to be better. You are going to live a better life after this war. And of course, with the GI Bill and so forth, that is precisely the alternative, a kind of social welfare capitalism, a democracy that is not limited by wealth or race or religion and so forth, but universally encompassing. So this is the model that the United States represented after 1945 and up to approximately the inauguration of Mr. Trump, who of course gave a shout out to the Nazi sympathizers in his inaugural address when he used the phrase America First, precisely in reference to the America First Committee of pro-fascist American business leaders in the 1930s.